Hello and welcome. For today's module, we read an article on utilitarianism. And with this module, we'll start looking at specific ethical theories. Our work so far has been focused on critical thinking and should have prepared us to read these articles carefully to ask the right kinds of questions and so on. Our work on structura and metaphysics should have given you the tools to effectively start organizing ethical ideas into the kind of hierarchical structures that will let us examine and compare ethical theories more effectively. Now, utilitarianism is the ethical theory that most of you should be very familiar with, and even the theory most of you subscribe to. It can be summarized in the Star Trek phrase, the good of the many outweighs the good of the few, or the one. Now, let's start by mapping out utilitarianism onto the structura system. As a reminder, this is the kind of layout we're trying to get. So what are the axioms of utilitarianism? Mill bases the idea of utilitarianism on the core principle that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and prevention of pain. So we have an axiom of human nature. All humans are the kind of thing that aims at happiness and away from pain. That is, maximize happiness and minimize pain. Now, Mill doesn't stop to give us his other axioms, like the axiom of the nature of the universe, but we can derive it quite simply from everything else he says. Because we can find the aim for pleasure and away from pain, and we can do so consistently, the universe must be a material and mechanical system which can be calculated, controlled, and predicted. Now, how do we know that this must be the second axiom? Because you can't coherently aim at anything if the universe is not the kind of thing that you can calculate, control, or predict. If you have no idea what your actions will produce, how would you possibly know where to aim? The third axiom we get here is the relation between human nature and nature. If we understand the world correctly and aim well, then we can act in such a way as to always maximize the available happiness and minimize pain. So that's your relation between what human beings are and what the universe is and how to bring those into harmony. So how do we use these three axioms to create a theory? Well, what we do is we start to unpack what they're actually saying and then try to see how the different implications of each axiom play off each other, right? So we're looking at internal coherence. The first thing to note is that the idea of happiness and suffering must be understood the same way by all humans. Now you might be wondering, why is that not in the axiom section? Well, because axioms are the kinds of ideas that you can't coherently ask questions of. There is no answer to a why for an axiom, other than because I said so. So any idea that can be successfully questioned with a why must not be an axiom. So let's try to ask why of our first piece of theory. Why is the idea of happiness and suffering understood the same by all humans? Because all humans are the kind of thing that aims at happiness and away from pain. Well, look at that. There's an answer to the why question. So this statement is not an axiom. It's a derivative. But try to ask that question again, and this time ask it of the axiom. Why are all humans the kind of thing that aims at happiness and away from pain? Well, there's no answer to give here other than because they are. All right, back to the theory. If all happiness and suffering must be understood the same way by all humans, then happiness and suffering of each human count the same. Therefore, when aiming to maximize happiness and minimize pain, we must account for all the happiness and pain that the action produces. That is, we can't give any person, including ourselves, a privileged position when looking at the results. Right, so how do we get these results? Well, since we're comparing happiness and pain of all people affected by a decision, we must be able to measure and calculate the happiness and pain. That's how we're going to get a result. So happiness and pain are calculable. And then, because we're supposed to compare these things, they must be comparable. In other words, they must use the same unit of measurement so that you can compare pain to happiness. Next, since the happiness and pain are what we're interested in, we must recognize that the same happiness and pain that are caused by our direct actions can also happen as a side effect of our actions. So if a person gets fired, They're the ones in pain, so to speak. But that loss of job also has a painful effect on their family, especially if they're the sole provider. We have to include that additional side effect of pleasure and pain into our calculation as well. And finally, there are two main ways in which we make decisions: ad hoc, on the spot kind of thing, or as rules. So act utilitarianism, which is the ad hoc version, says that we're supposed to do all of this work for every action. And that gives us the maximum flexibility in each decision we make, but it also requires far more time than we generally have. When you're trying to decide what to eat for breakfast, you don't really have enough time to sit there and figure out whether eggs or Cheerios are more ethical this morning. Rule utilitarianism, that's the rules version, says that for the vast majority of cases, we can lay down rules of behavior which will, generally speaking, maximize happiness and minimize pain. And that gives us less flexibility, but it does standardize our actions, it streamlines the process, and it allows us to teach moral behavior. So those are the main theoretical components. Let's move on to the practice. How should we act if we believe in utilitarian axioms and the theory they produce? We should ensure that our actions aim to maximize happiness and minimize the pain of the greatest number of humans. And we should do so through happiness-pain calculation made in context of the situation and with an impartial analysis that privileges all affected people equally. This calculation can be done as a rule for general cases or on a case-by-case basis for exceptional cases. Now, this definition should extend to every act that you do, so let's take a look at one that might be familiar to you. You want to go to college. Calculate it out. Who is affected by that decision? How much happiness and pain will it cause, especially over the time you're in college or paying off the student loans? What are you trying to accomplish by going to college? An education or job prep? What kind of alternative actions do you have available? If you're looking to just further your education, can you use Khan Academy or Stanford free online courses or other online courses to educate yourself for free and in your free time instead? Can you just go to a trade school which will get you a job in less time than a college and will cost you less than college? How much happiness or pain would either of those options cause? What should you major in? Are majors that are not socially constructive in a quantifiable way, or those that are not in demand, just a different way of causing yourself harm through loans and causing society harm through being a non-contributing member? Or are they valuable anyway, meaning that they cause happiness in a meaningful way that justifies them? Should you go to this university or that one? What are the different features of university systems that cause you happiness and pain? Does attending a school mean that you are supporting the work they do, the investments they make, and the standards and practices they use? If so, and yes, that's what it means, how much happiness or pain is your attendance causing? That's a practical application of the utilitarian theory, and it is the kind of process you should be engaging in for all your decisions, especially ones that are not already decided in a general sense. Finally, what about the world? How will the world look like if the practice and theory of utilitarianism match? Well, you should get something like a society that is flexible, maximally happy, filled with human beings fulfilling their purpose, that purpose being the maximization of happiness and minimization of pain. Alright, so what happens if our practice does not match the utilitarian theory? In short, you will create an excess of suffering. The exact nature of that suffering is not important. What is important is that human beings, whose purpose is to maximize happiness and minimize pain, will fail at that purpose and will be producing more pain than they need to. With that, we have completed the whole structura layout for utilitarianism. Now, let's go over some of the benefits of the system. 1. Universal inclusion of all humans is a benefit. Since you have to account for everyone who will be affected, this gives you a pretty even playing field. 2. The outcomes are supposed to aim to make everyone as happy as possible, in the context of all other people. Sure, you might feel happier if you could abuse other people, but since we're aiming at overall happiness, this is the best that you and everyone else can get. Now, if you think back to the problem raised in the Republic, this has that feature of justice as the last category. Pain is minimized by taking everyone's pain into account. Sure, you personally could be happier if you could do injustice and get disproportionate gains, But that would mean that someone else is suffering disproportionately, and you can't justify that action. And the reason you can't justify the unnecessary suffering is because the universal pursuit of happiness is an axiom of the system. Another benefit is that it reduces the question of morality to material terms. So it makes them quantitative and calculable. And instead of a vague sense of right and wrong, it gives you a seemingly more scientific way of determining the right thing. The term scientific here just means that we're treating everything as matter, quantifiable, measurable, and calculable, just stuff. And the reason why I use the term seemingly is an important one, and we'll get to that in a minute. The move of making science into a study of quantifiable materialistic universe only was started by Descartes in 1650 for mathematics, and then all sciences took on that idea eventually, so scientific. So what about the drawbacks? Well, there's a bunch of those. The first problem is the idea that happiness and pain can be quantified. If you've been in a hospital lately, like in the past 15 years or so, you've seen this handy-dandy chart rating your pain. You may have seen a 5, 7, or 10-point scale, and it tends to be accompanied by this highly scientific and quantitative image. Fact of the matter is, we have no meaningful way of actually quantifying emotions, and that's what happiness and pain ultimately are. But the problem gets worse. We assume that my happiness and pain can be compared to yours. Now, I grew up with a pretty nasty birth defect which took 21 years and 18 major reconstructive surgeries to correct. On top of that, I was a pretty accident-prone kid. I got about 30 scars between my two hands, that's just fingertip to elbow, and then another 50 or so across the rest of my body, and that's not counting the reconstructive scars. The ER doctors were on a first-name basis with me because I was in there every 2 weeks on average. And then I did 20 years of martial arts along with full-contact sparring. Now compare that to someone who's led a very sheltered life and never hurt themselves beyond like stubbing a toe. Now let's say we go to the ER together and we have the exact same injury. Let's say a clean broken arm. I'm rating my pain as a 5 or 6 on a 10-point scale because it's not that bad in my experience. Sheltered Sean, on the other hand, is rating it at an 11 because it is the most horrific pain that he's ever been in. So you see the problem here? Even with objectively the same damage, the pain is different. Let's say, in terms of psychological pain, a person loses their mother in a car crash. How bad is their pain? Well, it really depends. One person is going to be a complete wreck, and the next one might be dancing with glee, singing Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. This idea that emotion is quantifiable and comparable just doesn't really work. Next, we have a problem of what quantification would mean if it were possible. Here's a fun question for you. Can we put 1 million people into unimaginable agony if it means that the rest of the planet, the other almost 8 billion people, will be able to live lives of maximum pleasure? Maybe not 1 million, how about 1,000? How about one person? This question is the premise of a great short story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. There's a link in the description. Can we kill one innocent person in order to save the lives of thousands of others? If you watch any number of movies and TV shows, this is a super common plot. A terrorist has a nuke, the good guy has him cornered, but the bad guy has a child or girlfriend or wife or somebody that the good guy cares about and is using them as a human shield. Should the good guy stop the bad guy even if it means killing their loved one, or at least letting them die? Technically, you're all also guilty of supporting exactly these kinds of inhumane practices. If you have a smartphone, especially an iPhone, you have directly contributed to incalculable suffering of Apple's workers in China. These are people who assemble your phones. The working conditions at the factory are so bad that a number of workers kill themselves by jumping off the building. Apple's response was to install nets to catch the jumpers so they can go back to work. Now the conditions are that bad because Apple is trying to save money on the cost of their phone. These days an iPhone goes for about $800. Now if that same phone was built in the US, where workers' rights are a thing, it would come out a lot closer to about $10,000. So because you buy the phone but don't want to pay for that phone to be made in humane conditions, you're supporting the severe exploitation and abuse of thousands of people elsewhere. And if you have a different smartphone, don't feel smug about it. The working conditions aren't much better anywhere else. Now, you can turn this into an argument for taking the homeless and harvesting them for organs. I mean, you can get like 20, 30 transplant organs for each homeless person. So in terms of numbers, the harvesting approach is justified. I think you can make the same argument for harvesting poor people in third world countries. Now, here's another fun one. Normally, when we're looking to justify great pain inflicted on one person, we look for a similarly large increase in happiness by some other individual or a small group. Let's say the pain of being intentionally fed to a hungry bear is at a negative 1,000 happiness points. So we would look for an increase in happiness that is 1,000 plus points to at least break even, or end up in an overall happier situation. But what happens if the increase in happiness is super tiny, but it affects a lot of people, like in the billions? What if, for global entertainment, we took a random person every month and had a public execution by bear, televised? If 1 million people watch, they would each need to only get 0.001 happiness points to break even. If you could get a crowd of 1 billion to watch it, that would drop it down to 0.000001 happiness points per viewer to break even. Now, you can also think of this the other way. Imagine somebody innocent is accused of some horrific crime, but the general public thinks that they are guilty. If the judge gives the verdict of not guilty, one person is very happy. Perhaps their family is happy as well. Well, actually, let's go ahead and assume that the person is all alone. So there's just one of them. So that one person and their lawyer are happy. But the other, 300 million people in the country are upset. That being the case, would it be better to give a guilty verdict even though the person is innocent? I mean, you would create a lot more happiness with that decision, wouldn't you? Then we have the problem of human rights. Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher who really got utilitarianism started, had a line that says that rights are simple nonsense. Natural and imprescribable rights are rhetorical nonsense. They're nonsense on stilts. Now, there are utilitarians who try to advocate for some version of rights, but that position is, quite frankly, untenable. In order to have actual rights, you have to have values that cannot be bypassed or subverted by anyone for any reason. There is no room for excuses. There is no, you see, what had happened was, or, well, we were all going to die if we didn't break this rule. None of that. Rights, if they're actual rights, must be absolute, and they must apply absolutely to every single individual, no matter the circumstance. The whole conversation about weighing happiness and pain means that when push comes to shove, utilitarianism has to be okay with sacrificing anyone for the sake of everyone else, so long as the increase in happiness is good enough. That means that nothing is sacred. Murder, rape, theft, genocide, all might be okay if enough people are happy enough with the outcome. This is the ultimate tyranny of the majority situation. Sure, that kind of situation may not arise often, but it does arise. And we care about extreme cases precisely because they reveal the actual nature of an idea. Any idea whose consequences you don't like in extreme circumstances is bad under normal circumstances. It's just not bad for you. Sake of argument, if the rest of the human population all decided that some global minority group makes them uncomfortable, they could justifiably look to exterminate that entire group, so long as they did so kindly in a way that didn't involve much pain. And then 8 billion people would be very happy, while only 10,000 people of the minority were very sad. Now, to be fair, I think you can kind of make out a single human right out of utilitarianism. That right would go as follows. No one should ever be made to suffer more than is necessary in a given situation. Sounds pretty good, right? But the issue is that the phrase more than necessary is iffy. How much suffering is necessary? Look, clearly we can tell when people do go beyond the necessary. But since the purpose is the happiness of the largest number of people, the necessity is calculated by the increase in happiness. For reference, that smartphone example is precisely this kind of a situation. The happiness is there for a lot of people. The suffering is there for a minority. the necessity is not a necessity for survival, but we still support that process wholeheartedly and buy the new phone every year or two, continuing to invest in companies that make profit off of human suffering. The same can be said for shopping at Walmart and any other number of stores who use sweatshops, directly or indirectly, to make their goods cheap. Note that if you want to talk about rights, you have to go back to the structura. Now, find a place where those rights can be inserted in utilitarianism. It can't be in the world or practice because these are normative sections. Nothing happens here that is not directly supported by theory. Now, you can act out rights in practice, but that would be dishonest unless your theory tells you that there are these rights that you should act out in practice. So where in this theory can we find rights? Nothing here has a feature that would confer a right, because all there is maximizing of happiness and minimizing of pain. And we already noted that if that's a right, it's not much of one. Try to find a place, say, for the right to life. You might be thinking, hey, being alive makes you happy, that gives you a right to life. But that doesn't hold up. As soon as your death creates more happiness than pain, you can be justifiably removed. This is why the structura is so neat. It lets you identify exactly where the problem is occurring. As a final point of utilitarianism, let's look at the accuracy of calculations. Any number of things that were adopted by societies, including here in the U.S., were adopted because we were absolutely sure that they were leading us to a place where more people would be happy and less people would suffer. The issue is, we seem to be bad at this whole calculating thing, and to be honest, we seem to be bad primarily because we don't seem to understand just how insanely complex and interrelated society actually is. So communism looked great on paper, and then boom, you get about 100 to 120 million people dead. Now Mao had this interesting policies. They calculated out that sparrows eat some ungodly amount of rice every year, and that lowers the amount of food that's available for people. So they figured that if they just killed the sparrows, there would be more food for the rest of us. So what they did is they wiped out the sparrows. The next year they found out that sparrows had this unforeseen benefit that they hadn't accounted for. Sparrows ate locusts, and without sparrows, the locusts multiplied and ate all the food. It was literally a biblical plague of locusts. Whoops. As another example, and this one is much more complex, in the 70s, the argument for pornography went something like this: that people who appear in the films choose to do so. Infringing on their free choice causes them pain. The people who consume the product also do so willingly. Infringing on their free choice also causes them pain. No one else in society is caused pain by these choices made by the producers and consumers of pornography. Therefore, any prohibition of pornography with consenting adults only serves to create unnecessary pain. Now fast forward about 50 years, and it turns out that pornography is actually incredibly harmful. From sex trafficking and drug trafficking, psychological damage, accessibility to children, and then subsequent psychological harms there, and finally to addiction, ED, and so on, the harms are quite literally everywhere. Now for a detailed analysis, see link in the description for a TED Talk on the issue. The problem is that the foreseeable harms didn't accurately identify the majority of actual harms. Now that's understandable, given that a number of them are the result of technological progress which could not have been foreseen in the 70s. All this isn't to say that we shouldn't try to figure out the benefit or harm of proposed practices or behaviors, just that we should be aware that our ability to account for the actual consequences is rather bad, and thus trying to build a whole ethical theory on top of a system we're inherently bad at might not be the best idea. Utilitarianism sounds good until you dig a bit deeper. The idea of an impartial analysis to maximize human happiness and minimize human pain seems great until you happen to be the one that needs to be sacrificed for the happiness of others. And a great example of all the problems raised here is found in the varieties of the trolley problem, which will be the subject of our next module. If you have questions or comments, feel free to leave them here, or if you're a student, email me.